Hello and welcome back to On the Mic with Mike. I am Mike Jarvis. This time I'm joined by a guest who's been on before, someone who is now very familiar about what happens in Montserrat politically, developmentally. He's been in Montserrat. He has written extensively about Montserrat and the other overseas territories. I'm sure that no one would, or everyone, should I put it this way, would be quite familiar with Mr. Craig Brewin, who's been on with me before. Welcome back, Craig.
Thank you very much, and thank you. I think I'm the first person who's been on twice, so thank you very much. I'm very flattered.
I think you're the second person to have been on twice. Huh?
I'm still flattered. That's okay. Yeah, it's
Craig,
probably moving me, isn't it? Yes.
yeah, brilliant. So as I said, you've been following politics in Montserrat and the whole issue surrounding the redevelopment of Montserrat and what I've been saying where Montserrat is at the moment, a critical juncture in terms of whether or not Montserrat needs to have a reset moment. But you seem to have a different perspective because I've been tying that in with the current election, but the crossroads situation that I've been looking at, I'm getting the impression that you think we've passed that stage.
I, I, I know COVID has made a big difference here because the government can always say the fact that COVID came along derails them from anything they actually planned to do. But at the last election, I did think it was a crossroads. I remember Chedman Brown saying when he was a candidate, saying that why do we always act as if everything is normal when the situation we're clearly in is clearly not normal, and the conversation we're having should not be about normal things. And I thought that's actually quite a telling point because Montserrat is still recovering from a natural disaster. And although it was a long time ago, it's worth remembering that Montserrat is not just a developing country, but recovering from a natural disaster. So all the conversations need to be about that recovery, which was the point that he was making. And the point we were at the last election was that the government had just put together the sickbed budget, which government it was, British or Montserrat, and you can debate about. But the sickbed programme had been put together. It consisted of money from the EU, money from the CDB, money from the British government, and it came up to quote Don Romeo and later Cupid in his Calypso, it came to $200 million. So that $200 million was on the table for the subsea fibre, for the hospital, for the port, for new roads, for improvements to the school, and the money was there and the plans were there. The government also had very, very detailed and very good strategies for economic development, for health. The tourism master plan I thought was excellent. I thought the access strategy that existed then was excellent. Um, and that contained a huge amounts of information, even if you didn't agree with the conclusions. So all the research had been done. Um, the money was there, and there was a point at which you felt like they needed to push the button and go. There were also quite detailed plans that the previous government had to develop healthcare, not just build a hospital, but to develop the health system. There was a review done by the previous Mead government of the social welfare system, and there were plans around that. So it felt like everything was in place now to actually take a step forward, not to create an economic self-sufficient island, but to take a big step forward. So I felt at the time that was a huge um, a crossroads for Montserrat. I'm not sure there's a huge difference between what the parties were saying, and I think Montserrat politics tends to turn into a bit of a slanging match. Mainly, I think, because it's not much difference between the parties ideologically, so it becomes
Mhm.
quite personal.
Yeah.
So I think the debate got lost, and now we're having the debate again, and all we've done is shift on 5 years and said, well, now we're at the crossroads. But actually, the money's spent now or committed, and a lot of the strategies and plans which weren't delivered are quite old. The Sustainable Development Plan expired 2 years ago. And although I was involved in the consultation to rewrite that and
Hmm.
provide the disability input, that seemed to go nowhere. The plans to redesign the health system went nowhere. So whether it's possible to pull those back now and get back to where we were 5 years ago and say, right now we're at the crossroads, I don't know. But I think we were at the crossroads 5 years ago. And I know things didn't go according to plan, and I know COVID was a big factor in that. But are we at crossroads again? I'm not quite sure. I think the snowball is rolling down the hill really in terms of the sickbay program. So I don't think there's
Yeah,
a great
and
deal we can do.
is it a question of, to sort of phrase it this way, the crossroads is getting longer. It's in a sense it's been extended by another 5 years. I was speaking with another guest on the program, Colin Riley, a former government minister, recently, and in one of the recent editions, and he mentioned the terms that it this whole thing about the implementation deficit, because here we are again. The same issues that you mentioned for what you felt might have been the crossroads situation 5 years ago. It's the same issues again that we are confronted with, that we have not made a move on developmentally. And the whole campaign, it seems to have just descended into a slanging match.
Yes, I mean, I think a lot of the issues that we discussed, like access, they are not in any way party political. If you do a cost benefit analysis to work out what is the most effective way of bringing people to the island so they can develop the island, that's accountancy. That's not anything to do with politics. It's not a PDM or an MCAP or United Alliance issue. They, because of the party they're aligned to, do not have any better ideas about how to improve access than somebody who's in a different party. That's not how it works. You have to have a island-wide vision as to what access should look like. And then there's a professional view about how to achieve that. Now, that could be having an arm's length company that controls access, which is, I think, what they do in Sabah, which is an island you talk
Mhm.
about quite a lot. So I think you could do something like that. You can have public-private partnerships. There's all sorts of things, but these are professional issues, not political issues. All the professionals need to know is actually what do you want? And there was the reason the access went wrong was because basically the British government wanted to build an airport. Now, whether that's a good decision or not decision has a lot of factors at play there. But there was a review done by the International Commission for Aid Impact, and it said that the decision to build the airport was based on false analysis. They didn't say it was a bad decision. They said that the analysis was wrong because they assumed that air would be the only way of getting in and out of Montserrat. And it turned out once the airport was built that that was incredibly risky because you're dependent upon external airlines to run to Montserrat. And the immediate impact of the airport and the cancellation of the ferry was the number of people who went to the island, who visited the island, dropped, and it had a huge impact on the economy. So the ferry had to come back. So at that point, we had a ferry and we had an airport, both of which were losing huge amounts of money. And ever since then, which is over 10 years now, the government has been trying to work out how to fix that problem. The fact that it's trying to run both a ferry and an airline. And someone might say, yeah, well, we just need the ferry. Somebody else might say, well, we just need the airline. Somebody else might say we need both. But nobody yet has worked out how to do it, whatever it is. And the reason they've never managed to work out what it is no one on the island has come up and articulated it in a way that the majority of the people on the island can agree. So having a twin otter come in 2 weeks' time is no good whatsoever. You actually need a vision across the island of what access should look like. Should it be full-time ferries, full-time aeroplanes, or should it be something else? But that's what you need to do. And everybody who's got a stake in this in the island needs to work that out together, regardless of what party they're a member of.
And no, one of the guests, another one of the guests that I've had, Mr. Gary Morton, Dr. Gary Morton, has been talking about thinking big, having that sort of very wide scope of an outlook of what the entire island needs, and not being
Yes.
so partisan political. I mean, I've thrown out invitations to all of the political parties that I know of and all the leaders that I know of to come and take part. two have. That's Mr. Reuben Mead of the United Alliance and Mr. Donaldson Romeo. So the opportunity is there. But in speaking with Mr. Mead, he, in a sense, reflecting what you just spoke about and the way that the schedule is structured. I think your interview might be coming on after his interview, but his approach from discussions. He said to me that he's been having is that sort of very broad scope approach in terms of what the island needs for access, not just a short-term solution, but a long-term solution. But anyway, we'll have him, I'll have him address that.
Don't
You,
forget the whole strategy, the whole economic development strategy of Montserrat was based around ferry access. And this goes back to the Meade administration when they were trying to, well, and they still are, trying to build a town by the port at Little Bay. And the idea is that people will come because when they come, there is something there. There is an economic hub that will bring other entrepreneurs in there to try and sell things. And it would become like a second capital. And that was the basis of the economic development strategy, and it was the basis of the tourism strategy. But it assumed there was a ferry. So are we now scrapping that? Is that was all written down, all written down in plans? But is it now the case that that's not, is that up for debate now, whether there is a new economic hub around Little Bay? Or is that off the agenda now? It's very difficult to know. It was quite a clear vision about 5, 10 years ago. I'm not sure it is now.
well, we'll have to see how that pans out and how the parties and the candidates involved in the campaign take this issue forward. And in some respects, you get a bit more clarity and a bit more focus than in others, because yes, I do agree with you. It's almost a bit pointless to tell me that we need to resolve the access issue, because we know we need to resolve the access issue. We know we need to have the hospital situation sorted out. We know we need to have a tourism plan sorted out. But all of those are already there. I think, as Mr. Riley said to me, we don't need any more reports. We don't need any more consultancies. We have them all, and they're very well researched and put together. We just need now to go and implement them, notwithstanding the original questions that have been raised pertaining to the airport being what it is and being where it is. Well, it's there. We just have to figure out a way how to make the best of it. What I want to get on to, Craig, you wrote a very interesting article of about a week or so ago. And it has to do with the actual campaigning. I mean, I dare to say that you've probably outlined a 9 point strategy for the campaigning politicians to follow. Your preview of Montserrat Elections 2024, which you published on the 27th of August. Don't necessarily have to go through it point by point, but just give us sort of a general frame of what it is that you're driving at with this.
It's based on huge. I'm an ex-political scientist. Before I became an accountant and other things, I studied politics. So it's based on a lot of analysis of the election results. I started doing it looking at the 2014 election and what that showed and what the candidates needed to do. And then after the 2019 election, I just went through and looked at who was voting for who, where, and why candidates were winning and why candidates were not winning. So I did some fairly detailed analysis, and then I finished off with just an overall article about the campaign as a whole. So it's based on, it's not just off the top of my head, it is based on quite a lot of detailed analysis of the numbers, candidate by candidate, year by year, and electoral district by electoral district. And it was just quite fascinating about who was winning where and how big the result was. I mean, the overwhelming thing I discovered from that last time was actually if you make adjustments for the fact that different parties had different numbers of candidates, and then try and tweak the numbers slightly, the election was fairly even right across the island. Every single electoral district was neck and neck between PDM and MCAP, apart from Lookout, which MCAP and Ingrid Osborne as well, I should add, won by a landslide. So Lookout was sold to
Yeah, yeah, I
MCAP.
think you said Ingrid also. Ingrid Buffon, I think you meant that.
Yes, yes. Ingrid Buffon did she beat all the PDM candidates and a lot of the MCAP candidates in Lookout. So I can see why Ruben Mead wants her. But the if you look across the rest of the island, it was neck and neck. It was a really, really close election. And actually the electoral system itself and the way voters played the electoral system had a big impact on the outcome. But MCAP could easily have lost if PDM had run a full slate of candidates and had fought a slightly better campaign. They ran a very negative campaign. If they'd run a slightly better campaign and tried to retain the votes they got before, which were concentrated in three areas in the south of the island, big majorities they had in three areas. St. Peter's was one of them. If they'd managed to keep hold of that vote, which they lost, they would have won the last election. And if they'd run a different campaign, not had the defections, not had Don leaving them, they could have won. And I think MCAP probably realised that well, I wouldn't say they were lucky because they got so many votes in Lookout, but across the island, it wasn't a landslide for them by any means. They only won by one vote against the government or one seat against the government that wasn't particularly popular at the time.
I think someone said to me that they received wisdom in Montserrat from looking back to the 2019 election that getting Ruben Mead out of his quote unquote sick bed to campaign for MCAP actually pushed it over the line for them. I want to come to something that you've written here, your point four. You say, don't blame the British government for everything. Take responsibility for your own actions or plans. MCAP cancelled the permanent ferry. No one else. It's a decision they have to defend.
It's probably a decision. It's probably an issue they would probably keep off the agenda completely. I read something from one of the candidates on Facebook, which was a rewrite of history about how the ferry got cancelled. And I read that and I thought anybody who was there at the time would know that's not true. It was a really strange thing to say. And I thought that's probably best. They either will get together and get their line straight on this, or they don't say anything at all. And I said to somebody fairly senior in MCAP when the ferry was cancelled, I said to him, you know, if there's no ferry running at the next election, you can't possibly win, don't you? And he said, oh, there'll be a ferry. There'll be a ferry. But there isn't. And so, it's going to be quite hard. The problem with it, the reason, I mean, I'm a procurement professional, so I was looking at this in far more detail than most people. And I was quite surprised at what happened with the ferry because it's tendered every year. Every July, it's tendered. And they took a decision in July, was it 2020, wasn't it? When the pandemic hit. So a while ago. So they took a decision in July not to tender it. Like, that was their decision. There was no consultation with anyone on the island, or the provider, or the British government. They decided not to tender it. And the reason they decided not to tender it was because they thought they would get a better deal on negotiating with Jade and Son rather than tender it. And to some extent they did because they negotiated a huge price reduction in the year that the ferry was contracted. But with a month to go, they got themselves into a bit of a problem because they never had enough time to tender it and they hadn't got the price down anywhere close to what they wanted to do. And they had to give a month's notice, I think. So they just stopped the negotiations. I think there was a problem with the way they were doing them because I think the politicians wanted to make the decisions, but they weren't in the room for the negotiations. And that's never a good way of doing negotiating. The person in the room has to have the power to do the deal.
Yeah, and
And
added to that, we had a pretty odd situation recently where the current slash outgoing premier, Mr. Farrell, in an interview with the Government Information Service, announced that they had, I think, concluded a contract with a ferry company for $17 million for the ferry that I think came after the most recent one, and that would have been extended $17 million. And then shortly thereafter, he was in the parliament just scrapping the whole thing and saying, well, did you want me, words to the effect, did you really expect me to go and spend $17 million on a ferry when there are other departments in government or other services locally that needed government funding, which I've personally found very confusing to say
Well,
the least.
whether the money for the ferry is available for other things, the access budget is funded by the British government. It's not paid for by the Montserrat taxpayers. It's paid for by the British government, and they decide whether it can be used for anything else. Which is why not renewing the ferry contract, having not tendered it without then consulting the British government, was an extraordinary thing to do, and handed a lot of power over to the British government then, because once the ferry had gone, rather than put a ferry on a retainer, I mean, the obvious thing to do was to tender for a ferry to go onto a retainer. So look, we're in the middle of COVID, you're not working. We would like a ferry immediately when we need one. We don't know when that will be, but we'll put it on a retainer. We'll give you $1 million a year, but you've got to be at our beck and call when we ring you. That would have been quite a good deal.
Yeah.
But to say nothing at all and say, well, I'm just not having a ferry at all, that's it now. And then have to keep going back to the British government to approve the alternative is just handing over power. And you would have thought, really, I'm not a Montserratian, so I probably shouldn't be saying this, but you would have thought if you've got any power over anything, you hang on to it, don't you?
Well, I
And
think from all indications, the access unit is now within the ambits of the governor's office, which was
yeah,
something also very new to me, because I thought that since Mr. Romeo had taken it over while he was premier from the ministry responsible for transportation, that was then Paul Lowers, but that's a whole different story going on there surrounding that.
there was
It was in
something.
the
There was some.
office of the premier, but now apparently it's with the governor's office.
Well, there was something in the review. There was a review of financial aid. I don't know if they do it every 3 years at the end of every period. Now, I was still on the island when they produced the last one I read, and it said in there, it criticised the Montserrat government for cancelling the ferry, which was quite interesting. Governor's office wouldn't normally do that. It was written, used to be written by the FCDO, but I think this one was written by the governor's office, or at least published by it. And it criticised the government for cancelling the ferry without telling them because they had budgeted for the lower level of fees that they'd negotiated for that year that was still under contract. And then they had to pay it all back when the contract ended. So there was a direct criticism in there. But they also then said that the access strategy would now be produced by the governor's office. And this was about 3 years ago. So this is not new. I mean, it's something you have to read everything very carefully because there are always clues in there as to what's going to happen. But it did say in there that the next access strategy would be produced by the governor's office, which pretty much said that access would move there. I didn't know it had, but if you're saying it has, I'm not surprised because MCAP has given, or the government of Montserrat has given power over their access to the government, the governor. Her office has already said that they would taking responsibility for the strategy. It's a lot of money. It's ring fenced to the British government, not the Montserrat government. So you can understand why they would want to control what goes on, particularly given uh, previous attempts to create a viable access strategy that's operating has not been particularly successful. The
And I
governor
think
has
that
more power than people realise, and this sort of thing I
Well,
did want to say about
that's
it.
something that I wanted to lead on to because here we are speaking about the governor's office and the access strategy, which now falls within the ambits of the governor's office. And we keep hearing these things and commented on them and wondered about them as well. The governor and the governor's office now, not that much has been changed, I think, other than the FCDO, that the governor is now, to all intents and purposes, what the DFID representative used to be. The governor is the FCDO representative. But all of these things we are hearing, the governor's office and the overreach is the word that is used, and particularly with reference to the current holder of the post. But is that justified? Is that a justified criticism?
Well, I knew the older governor better than I know the current one. I mean, we've written to each other and we've shaken hands, I think, with the current governor, and that's about it. The old governor, he was there for a long time when I was in Ireland, all my time there actually. So I knew him better, and I would go to him with issues. And the difference is quite interesting with Andy Pearce. He would basically have a nice chat with me, very diplomatic conversation about issues I was raising, and then say, of course, there's nothing I can do about this because I don't run the civil service. It was usually HR issues, issues related to disability, which was one of my passions. And he'd say, well, because I don't run the civil service, that's delegated to the DG. You have to take it up. And he'd say, of course, I don't disagree with what you're saying, and I do hope this issue can be resolved. So he was very diplomatic, but very, very hands off. Now, the current governor, not quite so diplomatic and not so hands off. But I did check the constitution because I kept hearing about constitutional overreach, and I did check the constitution. So is it an overreach? And I'm not so sure. I can understand why emotionally people would think there's been a sudden change here and they're unhappy with it. I can understand that completely. But the current governor was appointed by a different department to the old one. The old one was appointed by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which is a diplomatic service run by the
Yes.
British government to protect Britain's
Yeah.
interests. The current governor wasn't appointed by the FCO. The current governor was appointed by the FCDO. The current governor is the DFID rep on Ireland. Now, the DFID rep on Ireland was somebody that Don Robio's government used to argue with and debate about hospital sizes and all this sort of stuff. The current DFID rep is also the governor. And the governor has got powers. So the DFID rep has now got powers. And if you look at the constitution, the governor runs the civil service. That's in the constitution. I didn't realise that because Andy Pearce persuaded me that it was nothing to do with him. I used to get quite frustrated because the current premier used to say the civil service was nothing to do with him as well. And I used to think there must be something to do with someone.
To someone, yeah.
And but the current governor, I've heard her say on the radio that she's the head of the public service. No problem about that. And constitutionally, she's correct. She appoints the deputy governor. She devolves functions to the deputy governor, whose role is primarily to support her. The deputy governor's appointment is agreed by the British Foreign Secretary on the recommendation of the governor. The deputy governor, has responsibilities for running the civil service, as Andy Pearce said, but it also says in the constitution that the deputy governor can be directed by the governor, which means that the governor is running the civil service constitutionally and is constitutionally allowed to. Now, that may not, you may think that's a constitutional overreach, but maybe it's a flaw in the constitution. But I think what she's doing, she's entitled to do. And she's doing it for a reason. I don't think she's doing it necessarily because she wants to be the bad person. I think she's doing it because she thinks she's doing her job, which is to get those capital projects delivered, to get them delivered on time. And she's using every power that she has at her disposal to do that. Andy Pearce also said that he would have done more if he had more capacity. He said he didn't have enough resources or capacity to do all the things that he was meant to do. And he felt that to some extent he was a failure, but it wasn't his fault. And he had raised this with the British government several times that he didn't have capacity to do everything that was expected of him. But the current governor is have given it a go. And she has consciously taken on more power than Andy did. And he did that, she's doing that because she thinks she can and she thinks it's the right thing to do. And I'm sure if people want to challenge that publicly, she'll respond. Maybe she won't. She would just say, I'm just doing my job and I'm doing the job to the best of my ability. But she has the power to run the civil service. And it is quite interesting. I heard her recently talking about HR matters. And you could not get Andy Pearce or Easton Taylor Farrell to talk about HR matters publicly. Neither of them would do it. And she's just stepped in and said, well, there's a void. I'll do it. So she was, I heard her giving a fantastic talk about the benefit of promoting Montserrat civil services servants to senior jobs and not bringing in people from outside because of the benefit that has to everybody else behind the promoted person and the ability for local Montserratians to develop their careers. And I thought, yeah, that's absolutely brilliant. But that's not a conversation that would be had outside of social media in the days of Andy
Mm.
Pearce and well, the current government who doesn't like to talk about HR matters. So to some extent, what she's doing is giving her taking power that she's been given and using it and being open and transparent about it because she is going on the radio talking about these things. And you can't criticize her for explaining in detail what she's doing and why she's doing it, even if you don't agree with what she's doing or that she should have the power. She is explaining it. So I'll defend her to that extent,
Yeah,
even though I disagree with her as well on a lot of what she does.
I know there was in one of the meeting of the parliaments, there was a resolution for a constitutional review, and a lot of the debate surrounding that issue had to do with the authority or the powers of the governor, and that's where this whole thing about the 2010 Constitution and how it was negotiated and formulated and how it came into being become a massive point of discussion. And well, we are yet to see what is going to happen with that resolution or that thought to have the Constitution reviewed and what that constitutional review would entail, including the powers of the governor. Which brings me to another point in that
Scott,
article
can I
that
just
you
say
did.
one more thing
Yeah,
before you move on? To
certainly.
Another reason why you should read things before as a predictor of what might happen. When the SIPREG program was agreed, um, within the SIPREG program, within the budget for the SIPREG, was an amount of money set aside for managing agents. There was also a grid program. The grid program was designed to create internal capacity within Montserrat so they didn't need TCs and they could deliver these functions themselves. The grid program died, and I think the British government was unhappy about that. CDB, who put the money up, was unhappy about that because they felt they'd wasted money on it. The managing agents also never came about. There were supposed to be managing agents to deliver all these projects, and they never happened. So it seems perfectly reasonable given that the grid program hasn't happened and the managing agents were turned out to be unnecessary, for the governor to say, well, I'll do it. And I think a lot of what the governor is doing is just going, okay, well, if you're not going to do it, I'll do it. I'll promote local Montserrat and civil servants to give them more career opportunities. I'll do that. I'll make sure the programs are delivered. I'll do that. If you don't want the agents. So I do think there is it's all right having the debate about what the Constitution says, but the current governor is interpreting it differently to the previous one, and they're both right, and they're both doing it their way for their own reasons to deliver what they think their job is.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how this pans out because there must be, even though there's a lot of collaboration and going on between that must go on between the governor's office and the elected political directorate, there has to be a point at which it is clearly understood where one's responsibility ends and where the other individuals or the other department or groups authority begins. So that would need to be sorted out because you're
Absolutely.
also suggesting, and let me preface that by saying, whichever party or whichever government or whatever construct of government that we have coming in after the October 24th election, they will have to deal with it. It's something that cannot be kicked into the long grass any longer and just to complain about things not going your way on social media. You have said and you've written, this will be an interesting and difficult election to predict. If we're talking now about whatever construct of government comes in, well, this statement that you've made here
Yes,
falls into that because you've also said all
it
four
does.
parties, well, I think we're now down to three, the merger or whatever that is between Mr. Romeo's party and PDM. All four parties could win seats, which would mean the person with the ability to get another four of their supporters over the line would win. Tell us about your analysis, how you
Yeah.
arrived at that.
Well, look at who wins. I mean, I don't know how many candidates there are. It starts about 50 or something. But if you look at who wins, the candidates that win are on party slates, and they tend to be politicians that have been in Parliament before. So the only two people who were elected last time who hadn't been in Parliament before, in the Assembly before, were Cranston Buffon and okay, Dawson Hector. So you
Yes.
had just two. The other seven were all experienced elected politicians. So if you look at that again and predict who is going to win, there are some serial winners there who win across the island. David Osborne wins across the island every time. Reuben Mead wins across the island. Don Romeo. Um, they do. Cranston Buffon topped the poll
Yes, it did.
last time. The time before that, it was Easton Taylor Farrell no, sorry, it was Don Romeo, followed by Ingrid Buffon was
Ingrid
second.
Buffon at that time. Yeah.
Yeah, so you've got a lot of people who are serial winners and have the ability to rack up huge amounts of votes, but they're split between three parties. So you would expect Cranston Buffon to get elected again. You would expect Reuben Mead to get elected. You'd expect Ingrid Buffon lost by 12 votes last time as an independent, so on as party slate. You would expect her to win, so that's three gone. You'd expect Don Romeo to win. He normally does. Paul Lewis is a party leader. So if you start ticking off candidates that are going to win, the number of ones that are left, it's not many. It's not many. If you say Paul and Don, Paul Don, they'll win. Pick two from MCAP. So the party leader, Samuel Joseph plus Cranston Buffon, the vote winner, and then Ingrid Buffon and Reuben Mead. That's six of the nine gone. And to win, if one of those parties wants to win, they've got to get the rest. They've got to get the remaining three. And that is not an easy task. And people used to say to me in Montserrat, and I've read recently on social media, people don't vote for a party. And I won't say who it was, but there was somebody on the island who I read their Facebook post saying, I voted for nine. I voted three for one party, they all won. I voted three for the other party, they all won. And then I voted three independents and they all lost. And I was thinking, well, you don't mind who the Premier is, do you? You're voting for the people who you think will represent your interests in the Assembly.
Mhm.
That's what you're voting for. And that's a good way to vote. But it means really it doesn't really matter who the Premier is. So if people are voting like that, it's really hard for one of those three parties to get those remaining three seats all going their way because people will want to vote for some of the independents, not surprisingly. And people don't tend to vote for the whole slate. It doesn't matter how many times you say for vote all nine, and all the parties have got nine. I think United Alliance has got eight, but they've all got full slates now. So people will not vote for them all. And I was working out how many votes do you need? How many votes does your fifth candidate have to get? The most important candidate for any party is the one that comes fifth, because it's the one that comes fifth that gets you over the
That gets
line.
you over the line.
So you need five really strong, credible candidates. Previous experience helps. I know Dwayne Hickson did very well last time, despite running for the first time. But experience helps. So the party most likely to win, if it's not going to be a hung parliament, which is looking very probable, but the party that gets the other three candidates, assuming they win two, needs to have three fairly experienced candidates because they're the ones that will get the most votes. And if you look at the party slates and you're trying to guess who's going to get the extra three, if they can get all three, you need to be looking at who's got the most experience and well-known candidates that people have, I say they trust because they've seen them in office before and they think they do the things that they want to do. So it is
And
it is it is quite hard to pick.
yeah, and that's another one of the sort of very unique features of Montserrat in total, our electoral system. There's a lot of discussion over whether or not we should continue with the all nine at large system, or should it be reverted back to some semblance of a constituency system or a split between constituency and at large, and how a diaspora bloc might fit into that to at least, have a say in the election of at least one candidate. That's another big discussion to have, but it feeds into what you've just outlined here. I might also say, Craig, beyond even complimenting you on the fantastic analysis and the time that you've spent going through the figures, I'm a bit saddened, and I've brought this to the attention of the Electoral Office as well, that they have removed the historical data on past elections from their website. That's something I would go to constantly to make comparisons, to do research. But I think it is fantastic that you have been able, I think a lot of that data now is somewhere within the statistics office. But from my perspective, they really need to return that to their quote unquote revamped website. Craig, I mean, it's so fantastic talking to you. I would say we have so much more to talk about that we could get into, but time is a bit against us. I'll give you final words, your final perspective, at least at this stage. Politics, things can change.
Yeah, well, I am still the head of research for the Montserrat Association, not head of research, sorry, the head of campaigns for the Montserrat Association for Persons with Disability, mainly because I haven't found anyone to take the role over from me. And so I would, if I can't use this time without talking about this really. At the last election, before the last election, we held a huge event and invited all the politicians to it. And they all came and they all gave speeches and they were all in very good. And we were really, really convinced that disability, which is part of the Sustainable Development Agenda, would be a big part of whoever won. And MCAP even mentioned disability in their manifesto. It didn't quite go as we thought. And probably not enough was done. And people criticise me for being obsessed with the beach toilets. But to me, it's just a symbol of how disability was completely forgotten. The fact that they built inaccessible toilets. So I would just make a plea again, I think, really, that all the parties remember that they are representing everybody, all nationalities, or different disabilities. A huge priority has to be getting people from school into work, and they're all at different stages of work readiness when they leave school, and that was to be a huge issue. So I will just make the plea again because so many of our members have left the island since we had that big event, including Iceman, who's left because of his disability. So if we could find it,
I think he's, yeah, he did. I thought he was still there. I'll have to check and ask him.
last time he messaged me, he was in England. So,
Okay, well, yeah,
but
people move around so
yeah,
quickly
so
and
we,
so
we
rapidly
can't
nowadays.
organise big events, but it would be absolutely fantastic if people could review their policies on disability and make sure they're accessible, particularly the workforce policies and the implementation of the labour code, which is very disability friendly, but doesn't reflect the Montserrat government's general orders. So there's lots of things that could be done, particularly with the new buildings, the new development, the health service. So just remember my little passion project and make sure there's some policies for persons with disabilities in your manifestos. But other than that, I have no idea what the outcome of the election will be, but it's going to be incredibly interesting.
Fantastic. Craig Brewin, thank you very much and keep up the good work.
Thank you very
Fantastic.
much.